Starbucks and Amazon was talking about Britain's need to compete on tax. And when I stood up and said, can someone please explain to me what this means? I was quickly closed down by the chair, because no one is prepared to discuss this. This is one of those big blind spots. Politicians have for a long time been using this shorthand rhetoric of tax competition, or we need to be competitive, to cut back on environmental protection, labour protection, to give tax subsidies to capital, and to deregulate the city, all done under the rubric of competitiveness. And it means nothing whatsoever. It's a very, very dangerous rubric. And this is a complete negation of democracy. What we're saying is we can't regulate the City of London, because to do so would be to make it less competitive compared to who? To Luxembourg, to Liechtenstein, the worst players in the world, the really toxic places. Is that what democracy is all about? So let's discuss that more a bit later on. But just one final observation on this idea of tax competition. When companies can't compete, what happens? They fail. When countries can't compete, what happens? They fail. Think Greece. Think all the failed states around the world. The logic of the economic strategy we are pursuing, and it's an inexorable logic, is that we are all doomed to fail. Democracy will fail because of this drive towards competitiveness. By the way, just to give you some idea of how much, an indication, no more than that, of how much revenue is being lost to corporate welfare and corporate subsidy in this country, 3 weeks ago, an academic from the University of York came out with an estimate based on 10 years of research. He reckons that subsidies, corporate welfare, costs Britain 85 billion every single year. 85 billion a year.
Pounds?
How?
Pounds.
Pounds, sorry, yes, yeah. I think that might be an underinvestment. An underestimate. But there you go. So that's a little bit of the theoretical background. I want to talk a little bit about my own experience, because in 1985, I was halfway through a PhD, and it wasn't going very well. There was no literature to support my work on tax havens, and I decided that I'd go home. I hadn't been home for about 12 years. I had just to visit family at Christmas. I had been home, but my home is Jersey. I'm a Jerseyman, and I decided to go back to Jersey undercover as an investigator, and I worked for a company called Touche Ross, now known as Deloitte Touche, one of the big four accounting firms. And I worked in their offshore trust and company administration division, so I actually got the opportunity to work right at the heart of the offshore tax haven beast. Now, previously, before I even went to university, I had trained here in London as a forensic investigator. For 4 years, I was training as a forensic investigator and actually investigated several major fraud schemes. So by the time I went back home to Jersey in the end of 1985 and started work in the beginning of 1986, I was already pretty well specialized in forensic investigation. But I was also, by that stage, qualified as an economist, and I had studied quite a bit of law as well for my master's degree. So working at Deloitte Touche across a very wide range of their clients in Jersey, I was able to use forensic investigation techniques to work out exactly what the clients were doing. And this is what my clients were doing. They were engaged in insider trading on a massive scale. Hundreds of millions being traded all the time through offshore companies to disguise who was behind it. But in one case, it was one of Britain's largest stockbroking firms had simply used and was consistently using an offshore company to disguise who they were, and they were consistently insider trading. The idea that LIBOR and capital exchange rate manipulations are relatively new is a nonsense. These have been going on for decades after decades. The whole of the City of London has been engaged in criminal activity through most of the last half century. They were hiding market rigging exercises, avoiding disclosure of conflicts of interest, illicit arms trading, illicit political campaign donations, contract kickbacks, bribery, fraudulent invoicing, trade mispricing, and tax evasion. That was just my clients. Sorry? Did they? They didn't need me to tell them.
They knew they were doing it.
Oh, they knew exactly what they were doing. What they were doing was they were using the secrecy of Jersey to hide from investigators.
They were telling you, and they thought that was all right.
No, because I was working on the inside. They kind of assumed I was on the side. But I had endless discussions. But let me be clear: I wasn't acting as a whistleblower. I was investigating I was looking at systemic issues. I've never actually revealed any client information. If I did that, even now, 20 years later, I'd be bunged in jail. Because you have to sign all sorts of hideous contracts which follow you to the grave. But they knew exactly what they were doing.
Yeah, but they told you.
Oh, no. In some cases, I had to put two and two together. But it's an easy jigsaw in most cases to put two and two together. And of course, over the years, you get to know the clients quite well. What Jersey does is it provides deep secrecy so that capital operating out of the City of London can hide its identity behind Jersey's secrecy. I then went on to become economic advisor to the government of Jersey, which I did for 11 years. I ran the economic advisors department for 11 years. And that was particularly useful. That was not expected, by the way. It's just out of the blue. A team of headhunters came to me and said, "You're an economist. They're looking for an economist. Would you apply for the job?" And I applied, and I got the job. But working from the inside the government, I realized that actually the government was totally in cahoots, working very closely with London and with the British government to create this enabling environment. I got more and more pissed off, so that by the time we reached the mid-1990s, a rather small scandal came up involving Jersey, and the Wall Street Journal contacted me about it. I decided I was going to cooperate with them totally. And that's my resignation letter there, by the way, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, saying, by and large, Jersey's politicians are totally out of their depth. And that's really crucial. These were small-town politicians. Most of them were running corner shops and guest houses. They were clueless about how to regulate international capital. But they were very, very, in most cases, vain, like many politicians are. They loved the idea of being wined and dined by Barclays and UBS and Bank of America and so on, and told how important they were and how important it was that Jersey had such and such a deregulation or weak regulation or whatever. So they went along with it. So Jersey, like many of these tax havens, lives of lax regulation and deep secrecy. But I think it's wrong to divorce Jersey from Britain, because Jersey is intimately politically linked to Britain. And that's what my experience taught me. I spent more time in London talking to Treasury, Home Office, and other departments over here about things in Jersey than I did in Jersey. And that's precisely because they were very interested in what was happening in Jersey and wanted to make sure that no scandals blew up, even though they knew that Jersey was a hotbed of crime. They just wanted to make sure that everything was kept, in that very British way, kept under wraps. Hence, this headline, I don't often get into the Daily Mail, but this is the front page of the Daily Mail. Britain is high on the list of the most corrupt countries because in the mid-2000s, I spoke at the Royal Geographical Society's annual conference, which had the theme of the geography of corruption. Now, at that time, everybody, World Bank downwards, was pointing fingers to the south and saying, corruption happens in Africa. Look at the Corruption Perceptions Index of Transparency International. it's African countries and Latin American countries, they're irredeemably corrupt. And I said, hang around a second. Let's look at corruption in a very different light. Whoops, wrong one. Missing out on this. Sorry, I'm in the wrong order here. I said, actually, it's time we looked at corruption in a very different sort of way. Because if you're just looking at local officials, underpaid customs officers in Africa and so on, you're missing out on the very big, the big picture of corruption, the huge enabling environment which allows the really wealthy to steal massively from Africa and Latin America. Africa is not, most African people are not corrupt. They are the victims of corruption. But where does the money end up? I'll get round to that in a second because I've lost the slide. It's here somewhere. But one of the consequences of, creating this huge, secretive, offshore financial services economy is that tax evasion and tax avoidance have become endemic. We now have a situation where most countries around the world are obliged to attract capital by engaging in tax competition and by offering endless subsidies to capital. We have essentially lost our national tax sovereignty because we're not able to tax capital effectively. We've seen a huge growth of what's called ownerless assets. A huge proportion of the wealth, the trillions and trillions of dollars of assets held offshore, actually belong on paper, legally, to trusts and foundations, controlled by lawyers and bankers. And on paper, at least, or legally, in a court of law, the people who benefit from these assets are not the owners of these assets, and therefore they're not liable to tax on those assets.